Yes, yes. Now we're good. Okay. Well, thanks for joining. And now it sounds like formal, like we're shifting into television interview mode. But, we're here to talk a little bit about Foucault and biopolitics. And the way I've been starting these things off is just by asking each of you folks who are for whom Foucault's concept of biopolitics has been important to your thinking and to your scholarship, to talk a little bit about, just to set up why you think that this particular dimension. I mean, look, there's many Foucaults, right? And so when I was in graduate school, for instance, the biopolitical Foucault wasn't really on the radar screen. I mean, it wasn't something, that's not true, but it wasn't predominant, whereas it seems as if that is the Foucault that people are talking about today. And to give you guys an opportunity to talk a little bit about its relevance for you, or for rhetorical studies more generally, or for theory in general. So. And Stuart, for instance, your connections to thinking about neoliberalism that you've done in your work is potentially one avenue to responding to that. So I'll throw that out to you, Stuart, first, and then go from there.
Thanks, John. So, yeah, precisely. There's a connection for me between biopolitics and neoliberalism, and there's a problem specifically in thinking about the present as we've moved, as Foucault says. And I should probably mention that the common text that we looked at here was the lecture of 17 March 1976 from Foucault's Society Must Be Defended at the end of that term that Foucault was giving, where he gives a pretty succinct overview in 76, which is, of course, just sort of following Discipline and Punish and History of Sexuality, Volume 1. He gives a pretty succinct overview of the shift that he sees taking place at the beginning of the 19th, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, between sort of sovereign power and biopower, or what he calls biopolitics. And if I can, rather than answer my own question, I'd just like to read that moment on page 241. It's a short paragraph, but I'm sort of struck by this because it gives a sense of what the central problematic is for me, and how Foucault's really useful. And it's interesting just to listen to him, the way the way it's written, but the way he lectured it. There's a great hesitation. There's even, if we pathologize it, there's even a kind of perseveration that's going on here. He says, Foucault, and I think that one of the greatest transformations political right underwent in the 19th century was precisely that, I wouldn't say exactly that, sovereignty's old right, to take life or let live, was replaced, but it came to be complemented by a new right, which does not erase the old right, but which does penetrate it, permeate it. This is the right, or rather precisely the opposite right. It is the power to make live and let die. The right of sovereignty, concludes this paragraph, the right of sovereignty was the right to take life or let live, and then this new right is established, the right to make live and let die. So, a number of scholars, Agamben amongst them, of course, but Negri and others have sort of taken up this question of the place of life, which starts to take hold in the middle of, or the beginning of the 19th century, towards a new criminality, a new penal sort of institution, towards a new form of governance. We've chopped off the head of the king in France, at least. It's the birth of biopolitics, but the birth of a particular form of medicine as well. And I've been sort of obsessed by these slogans, and they're schematic, and he perseverates. He's not sure, they're overlapping and so on. There's a movement going on, right? So in the shift in sovereign to biopolitical slogans, the one which is a disjunction, the sovereign right to take life or let live, so the sovereign has the prerogative to act on a life that's already there, as it were, whereas this biopolitical right or state power, we might say, between making live and letting die. And we've moved from the disjunction, the sovereign's prerogative to take life or to let live, because life is already sort of on the scene, to this new power, this new state power, which is to bestow life or to make it, and at the same time to let it die. And I'm interested in the move from the disjunction to the conjunction. In other words, the sovereign right is to either or. The new right, the new political power is both and. It's both to make live and let die. And I think the and I think Agamben doesn't quite do justice to it, and few people have. I think the and is there's a kind of hydraulics there. There's a kind of economy of life and death. They enter into a kind of economic order in the way. Mbembe is one of the scholars who's picked up and understood this correctly, that there's a kind of trade-off. Making live also means letting die in a certain sense, and this is what Foucault is pointing to in this lecture. We make live to the extent that we allow others, non-lives, others whose lives do not matter, we allow them to die. We don't kill them, he says, but we subject them, we make them precarious, we subject them to a certain order in which their lives are not fostered. And that sort of economy of livingness, if you will, is what's really driven my research in recent years, and I'm interested in the ways that this happens in our institutions, right? And not just sort of geopolitically, but also within the prison industrial complex and so forth, within sort of political economies of race, say. Which operate differently on both sides of the border. In Canada, there's a question of Aboriginal lives or Indigenous lives being overrepresented, hyper-incarcerated, and of course in the U.S. it's black and Hispanic lives that are subject to hyper-incarceration, death penalty, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, cool. No, that's good. And it really, as I was reading this stuff on race, particularly, it really does speak to the contemporary American, the Black Lives Matter movement, and what you're saying about letting die, because the response from a certain political position is to say, but nobody's doing anything to Black lives, and Foucault's response is they're being let die. No one is actively killing. It's not a question of active killing. It is a question of putting in precarious situations such that letting die becomes more likely for certain populations than others. So it definitely speaks to that. So,
right. Even when there is an act of killing.
Yeah.
There's a sort of construction of that identity, which it's almost as if they're doing it to themselves, and here I'd ask Dave to leap in, because I'm thinking about his text that we read, Rhetoric and Power, the kind of metonymic slippage that happens. And I know, Dave, your paper's concerned with strategies of confession, but in terms of biopolitics, I would, there's a huge metonymic slippage between what life is and what it is to make live and so forth.
Yeah, that's great. A lot like John, my early work on Foucault I was struck as I was even rereading it today. It's sort of embarrassing to say, but it just skips over the biopolitical years of really 76 to 79. And I wish I hadn't done so, but I did. And I think Stuart's right. I think as Foucault moves on into the late 70s, he does become increasingly schematic in these visions of power that he articulates. And so I think of on a number of different occasions, we get like the beginning of Security Territory Population, for example. We get all these articulations of how sovereign power relates to biopolitical power relates to disciplinary power, and all these sort of modulations he draws between these various forms of power. Within those schematics, there's one thing that's particularly of interest to me, and that's the point of the application of power. So where does power latch onto its subjects? Okay, it seems that for each mode of power, if we wanted to, we could go through and sort of schematically articulate where in disciplinary power, for example, does power find its hold, right? The word hold comes from discipline and punish. In the essay that we read, this March 17 lecture, there's the inelegant phrase early on. It says, biopolitical power has, he calls it, a different bearing area. I don't like the phrase, but I think what he's getting at is that one of the ways you can distinguish different forms of power is their point of purchase on either a subject or a population. This is why metonymy is important in the regime of disciplinary power, because metonymy created this sense of interiority according to which then disciplinary power would latch on to its subjects. And down the road here, John, we should talk about the sort of relationship between metonymy and the tradition you work with in your piece of the fold. I'm thinking here of your quotation of Deleuze. It seems like in the metonymy or the fold are both sort of mechanisms by which we characterize the inside as an effect of the outside, doing similar sorts of work. And in both cases, the sort of inside as effect becomes the purchase point, right? So in discipline and punish, the soul becomes the latch or purchase point of power. Now it's interesting to think about this in terms of biopolitics. A lot like Stuart did, let me take you guys to a sentence from the March 17 lecture. It comes on page 246. It's right in the middle. Talking again about the purchase point of biopolitics. He says, biopolitics intervenes at the level at which these general phenomena are determined to intervene at the level of their generality. Okay? It's an interesting move right there to think about where biopolitics latches on. It's at the level of generality. Okay, so a couple questions about this that I don't have answers to. I'm curious what the relationship of this generality is to what I had heretofore thought of as a depth that power latched onto vis-a-vis metonymy, because they are sort of, they're both abstractions in a certain sense. Another comment would be, and this is sort of what drives my interest in biopolitics right now, is just think of, I was thinking of Ferguson, but also of the Syrian refugees that I can't sort of read the newspaper without learning about these days. This is power which is attaching itself to statistical estimates, to questions of demography and population movement, right? This is power attached at the level of generality or at the level of a population. And finally, and this goes to Stuart's point, and this is what's most interesting to me about biopolitics. I don't want to say it tentatively here because I haven't quite thought it all through, but it seems like biopolitics attaches itself at the level of an economy. And in that sense, there's a structural similarity between biopolitics and neoliberalism, both of which work at the level of population, both of which work at the level of a general economy, and then let people within that economy die if need be. I think that's a dangerous move. And I think Foucault nails it in this essay, but I also think in a sort of strange way, the character, Stuart, I'm blanking on his name, but the character in your piece...
the guy who says she's not a victim?
Yeah. In some way, he nails it, right? Vic Toes, I'm not quite sure how you say his name. He said Ashton Smith is not a victim, and you're right, that's callous, and that's politically dangerous, but in some ways, he's right. I mean, because a victim is a political category, right? And I think of Foucault, like later on in this essay, where he says the beauty of biopolitics is that the political categories are trumped by economic categories. We no longer have adversaries, and you might say in this case we no longer have victims. We have something else here, and I feel like the power of your article, Stuart, is calling that something else a new form of homicide, right? Because you're trying to write it back into the old strictures of the political, which are valuable to us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's sort of a long-winded way of saying biopolitics is important to me for a lot of reasons, but most importantly, it is onto something with this sort of with its purchase point, a purchase point at the level of the economy, which sort of has the effect of trumping the political and has the effect of making it possible for people like Vic Toes to say Ashley Smith is not a victim, and that seems a little dangerous to me.
Well, yeah, I'm with you all the way on that. You need disciplinary power in order to make a victim in a certain sense. You need disciplinary power drawing on sovereign power. Discipline, as Foucault says, individualizes, right? Whereas biopolitics massifies. So when she dies, she's merely a statistic. She's merely collateral damage, a negative externality, we'd say.
That's what I mean, just to jump in, like, it's an unfortunate economic byproduct. I mean, it really is sort of thought as a waste product. That, of course, you don't want to have a waste product, but the uranium is going to do something, so you've got to put it somewhere, you know, and that is the terminology for thinking about it.
And this, to me, sort of just to offer a kind of a mirror to what Dave says, thinking about how the objects, or perhaps the subjects, the subjectified objects that power grasps. I'm interested on the mirror side, or the other side, where that power is coming from. So we have a very Enlightenment vocabulary that we recognize when we talk about sovereign power. We have this, and we can. It's localizable, right? And we can point to it, and we can say, "Oh yes, it's there," and it individualizes me. There's this effect called the soul. It becomes the prison of the body, and so on. I can become a victim. I can be attached to my identity in some way. Whereas when you have biopolitical power, particularly within a kind of within the web of a global economy that operates with anonymous and diffuse in anonymous and diffuse ways, whether these are, you know, correctional officers, nurses, counter-terrorist strategists, you know, high-frequency electronic trading, and so there's nobody, there's no sovereign, there's no one who decides in that sort of Schmittian way. There's no one who decides who will take life or let live. There is a kind of anonymous system that recommends, as it were, that this, you know, based on some sort of economy, right, that this population will live and that this population over here will be allowed to die. And it's unfortunate, but, you know, it makes life stronger, it makes life healthier, it makes life better. It's, as Foucault says, in this kind of trade-off.
Okay, this is great. So let's keep with our schema here. So where does power come from is the question Stuart puts on the table. Schematically, in sort of Foucauldian spirit, under the conditions of sovereign power, power originates with the state. Under the conditions of disciplinary power, power comes from, we might say, an administrative bureaucracy.
Institutions, yeah.
Institutions, the institutions of writing, whatever. Under biopower, I love Stuart's phrase, anonymous system, right? Because one of the things that biopolitics and neoliberalism shares in common is sort of heightened importance given to the category of the invisible, right? So I think of like like the invisible hand. It's like these sort of invisible systems that latch on to the economy and govern the economy vis-a-vis a system of always shifting parts that you can never like nail down one of them, and because you can never isolate a part, it renders the sort of origination point of power less visible than it ever was in either disciplinary power or sovereign power. So I think we should keep the term invisibility on the table.
Let me throw
say immunity as well, because it's that sort of power becomes immune to critique.
Yes. Did you say immunity?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Let me throw a wrench, or what I think might hopefully be a wrench into this thinking, because and it is around this question of anonymity. Because at some level, given what you said, and I think you're right. I mean, Dave, I think that your analysis is spot on. Now, I would quibble over the term metonymy metaphor in ways that I don't actually think matter. But in terms of this question of installing an interiority through external forces, that substitution is what matters. But at the same time, it seems as if there's this way in which the exact opposite move, which is the rendering anonymous and not interiorizing or not establishing a recognizable persona, is just differently dangerous. Which is to say, if you think of this not in terms of the individual subject is the one who gets a soul and becomes an interior subject, but we're saying, well, the problem is the state doesn't have a sovereign anymore. Right? The state doesn't have a face. It doesn't have a recognizable identity. It doesn't have a unity around which it can metonymically articulate all these things, and so therefore can evade responsibility, can be immune, etc. But isn't that exactly the thing that he's diagnosing as the problem in the confessional dynamic and the disciplinary dynamic? Does that make sense?
So did sovereign power ever have a sort of metonymic origin? Or is that just a property of disciplinary power?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ways the terms map up is always confusing to me, and they do seem to mutate, like sovereign and discipline and biopolitical seem to mutate in different ways. And this is perhaps just an aside for clarification's sake, but it always seems really important to me to not simply think of Foucault as offering a stage version of historiography where once you had this, then you had this, then you had this, and not even a residual emergent, not even that kind of version of historiography. That what you have is sort of overlapping modes and accretions of different formulae, and so it's almost counterproductive to say, is that disciplinary or biopolitical, or is this sovereign or biopolitical? Because they're all always operating in any particular, orchestra of action. They're just tendencies or orientations. But to me, if what Foucault does a wonderful job diagnosing is the emergence of a recognizable interior self, right? In not a technology of the self, but as a sort of the emergence through confession and through 18th century, 19th century practices of the emergence of an identity. That in fact, it seems what the state has learned how to do is get rid of that, right? That the state has sort of outstripped. It has technologied of the self. If we want to use those distinctions, it's going faster than the subjects that it is, or it's ahead of the subjects that it is producing.
Why do you think the state has gotten rid of the sort of category of identity?
Well, because there's no one. I mean, it's what Stuart was saying before, and I think he's quite right. In the case that he looks at there, it's really quite clear to me that there's no one to blame, right? No one's done anything. No one has done. You have a series of institutions and policies that have circulated this person based on understandings of mental illness and criminality, and no one has done anything wrong. And I love the term that you use in there, where you use the term extra legal. It's not illegal, right? It's just not really covered. And that's exactly the thing that I'm pointing to. Is like, there's not a state actor there. It's not the Corrections Institute. It's not a health policy. There isn't someone that you can point to and say, there's the problem, right? And that's what's that?
You point to an entire economy and say the economy is the problem, and what we need is a sort of better redistribution.
Right. I mean, I think perhaps you would have to go to that, but that's what I'm saying. The thing that that case illustrates for me is the ways in which, you know, power has become delocalized, and that's a strength, right? That's a positive attribute of this neoliberal version of. And by positive, I don't mean I like it. I mean positive, which is to say it's an enabling condition for how this works. That in fact, insofar as it's like it's become anonymous and distributed, it has learned how to do the technologies of the self thing. Because what sucked is when someone was held responsible, right? When someone was to blame. I mean, I'm just talking. I didn't mean to end everything there.
No, that's good. Okay, I want to. Couple quick comments. First, John, I agree that you can't read Foucault in any sense of sort of doing historical periodization work. And in fact, the sentence or that Stuart read off page 241, right where we got started, I think is really good because it says, I wouldn't say that sovereignty's old right to take life or let live was replaced, but it came to be complemented by a new right. So I'll say Foucault's very sensitive to the ways in which the different modes of power interpenetrate and coexist with each other. But he's also very good at and very insistent on the sort of schematic thinking where he will, after these sentences where he talks about the permeation of sovereign power and biopower, he will then pull out biopower and analyze it on its own terms for pages on end. And so it's sort of that movement that I was trying to channel when I was responding to the earlier question. And one of the ways we might think together or think biopolitics and disciplinary power together is the question of redistribution. Economies, if they are to push in directions other than they're currently moving, have to be redistributed, right? Because they're a network, you have to sort of reorganize the network. Same thing, Foucault has this great line all the way back in the Archaeology when he's talking about this metonymic logic, and he says, if you can refuse the metonymic logic and attend to the surfaces of things, what that allows you to do, and then he uses the word redistribute. He says, according to a I can't remember what his exact term is, but something like according to a thoughtful logic this time, like according to an intentional logic rather than just having a metonymy organize the field for you. If you can like get back to that level of surfaces, then you can do your own work of reorganization. All that to say, part of what's going on here for the question of resistance is going to be the question of redistribution, which is going to be obviously a key economic term, but also a key term of power for Foucault.
And the difficulty there is that redistribution will happen along the lines of populations, and a population is a metonymic term par excellence, right? So, yeah. So Foucault points out, why did we move from disciplinary power to biopolitics? Easy. It was much more efficient. Yeah. You could deal with groups. I mean, it's too time-consuming and too cumbersome to individualize people. The trick is to make everyone feel like a special snowflake, even though they're all shopping at the Gap or wherever. You might have to edit that out. That wasn't a plug for the Gap, but everybody is the same, or they're sort of categorized according to not the things. And this is again, John, Dave, about a sort of a metonymic power, right? People are organized not according to their particular illnesses or the particular crimes that they've done. They're organized population-wise as at risk, etc., according to what's endemic to them, right? So he says in biopolitics, we've moved from epidemics to endemics, right? So I
mean, one question here that puts itself, that comes forward, at least to me, is, again, the question that John put on the table: where's Ashley Smith in this schematic? And I think of sort of at the end of the lecture we read, he said the reason sexuality is so important is because it sits at the intersection of these two modes of power. And I wonder if Ashley Smith is there as well, in as much as she spent years in psychiatric clinics. She had to be a victim of a metonymic logic, but she was also a statistic within a biopolitical regime. And maybe I should revise what I said earlier, and to be more precise, it's not that Ashley Smith was not a victim, it's that she was both a victim and a statistic. Mm-hmm. And people like Vic Toes, when they needed to get off the hook, could simply hang their hat on Ashley Smith as statistic, and then when he's back at work in the office, could hang his hat on Ashley Smith as victim. He can play it both ways at once, in other words.
But see, that's precisely to me what I see as the danger of the, let me say, I'll say this. One of the things that your piece did so well for me, Dave, was it helped me understand the most troubling line in History of Sexuality, Volume 1 for me, which is the point of resistance needs to be bodies and pleasures. And I always just like that line, always, it's like in this whole book where you've just consistently showed me that every attempt to get outside of this deployment is reinscribed in this deployment, and that one, instead, I would think that one must, live inside the economy to rearticulate it. And when he says that moment of bodies and pleasures, and my reaction is like, what? Where is this coming from? And your piece does a great job explaining to me the answer to that. Which is, and it's a suspicion that I've had for quite some time, which I feel like Foucault fetishizes the literal. If you want to think of it in metonymic terms,
could we say he fetishizes the surfaces?
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, the surface and or when I'm thinking of the particular rather than the sort of generalized ecology, and that's to me the thing that's getting missed here in the biopolitical, is that that's what the biopolitical does. The biopolitical population thing has committed itself to surfaces.
No. Why is I think Stuart's right on this.
Because population is functions metonymically, but I mean, to me, it also becomes this way of just moving lots of, like, this thing happens and this thing happens. It's like a paratactic logic without an overarching understanding of a unified principle. Yes, you can hide behind like nationalism in those various versions, but nobody really believes in that. That is the sort of hangover chimera of sovereignty. And so that's where, to me, like, the Ashley Smith story is a story of the technologies of the self, of dispersion, rather than the opposite.
So how would we adjudicate that question? How would we know whether or not Ashley Smith was sort of embodiment of the literal particular surface event that Foucault fetishizes, or how would we know if Ashley Smith was in a sort of embodiment of a population in this broader category? What would it take to resolve that?
It takes her to die. That's it's she's not a person until she's dead, and there's an inquiry into her death, and then she's a body that matters. Before that, she is not, because her life is, her biological life or existence is part of the wider management of the population that the state sort of orchestrates, right? it's her death that the state can't tolerate and wants to, forget.
But and that's interesting to me because I think that you're exactly right. I mean, so in the way that I'm thinking about this, which is that she can function as this sort of series of surfaces. There's no one organizing, there's no conspiracy to keep her in any particular bad situation. It's just a series of movements from place to place to place to place. And then in some ways, her death allows her to become a metonymy, which is to say, it allows her to become a person who something was done to during the course of, prior to that, that wasn't the case. Right? And so that's the way in which I go, well, hold on a second. Maybe these confessional disciplinary things can be mobilized as bulwarks against that sort of surface paratactic. I just think paratactics. We're all tropologies all the time. Do you know what I'm saying? As opposed to the other way around, and that's where I say, that's where for me the kind of what I'm calling Foucault's fetishizing of surfaces seems problematic, which is, in this case, I think surfaces were the problem, right? And in fact, identity, unity, interiority are the things that could have been and are now serving retrospectively as sort of bulwarks against the anonymous paratactic surface.
Wasn't her metonymic identity as a mentally troubled person what kept her within these, how many institutions? 5 or 6 different institutions?
More, yeah.
You can't.
It's not one or the other. I agree with you. It's not one or the other. You're right. But I'm simply saying there isn't a meta level or transcendent organization. There is just a series of movements from place to place, and those movements are dictated precisely by mentally ill criminal, right? That category dictates a series of surface movements. So you're right. I don't think it is either or, and I'm probably caricaturing it. Because I'm just suspicious of the commitment to the literal, or to the surface that I see throughout,
I think it's actually quite savvy of you, John, to be suspicious of the literal, because I think that suspicion is going to take you to the heart and, dare I say it, soul of Foucault, right? Because that's what he hangs his hat on in both biopolitics and disciplinary power. That's why that line at the end of the first volume is so haunting. But I think it's there for a reason, because he does hang his hat on that sort of fetishization of the literal, right? And he even, and I sort of pointed this out at the end of the article, he took it so seriously that at one point he argued for legislation that would treat rape as a physical violence only, right? And that clearly had feminists up in arms, and I imagine sort of that is one of the things that's pushing you, like it pushes me, towards this, like, we got to be critical and suspicious of this valorization of the literal, in as much as, that's a fairly radical implementation of that. But it is logically consistent. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the heart and soul of Foucault right there.
Well, I didn't mean to go to heart and soul.
That might be too strong, but
that was like a Huey Lewis reference you just made right there. Well, let me throw something else out there, because as I was reading this essay, or this lecture, throughout the first 3 quarters, I was like, he's talking about Nazism, and then of course he gets to it, and so I thought I was really smart that I'd anticipated that it was going to go there. But he says something in this case that I found questionable, which is to say, Nazism for him depicts a kind of terminal point of the intersections of sovereign, disciplinary, biopolitical convergences, which is like you've got what are the 3 factors? It's homicidal, it's suicidal, it's racist, it's murderous, and it's suicidal. And this is, of course, you know, Nazism alone took this play between the sovereign right to kill and the mechanisms of biopower to its paroxysmal point, which is to say, the idea here is that, or at least the image that I'm getting here, is that Nazism followed these things out to their most sort of logical conclusion, and most nation states today aren't doing that. But is it because they're somewhere shorter on the continuum, and that logic is what informs them as well? Or is it because they're actually just operating differently? You know, because, so for instance, the racism part of it makes total sense to me. The murderous part, the letting die thing, makes total sense to me. The suicidal part doesn't. You know, in terms of contemporary power, and so I'm wondering if was this conceived of, and you guys are more historians of Foucault than I am, was this conceived of with, you know, the notion that allowing the disabled and the weak to die was done in the interest of the purification of the race? That strikes, I mean, when you hear that, that's like, yeah, that is euthanasia. That is, I mean, we know from history various versions of that, but it doesn't seem to me to adhere to our contemporary. It doesn't seem like that's the case. That one is trying to justify police violence in this country through that notion of purity. Not that there aren't people on the right who won't do that, but that strikes me as actually that argument or that justification is the loony one, you know?
I have trouble with the last pages of this lecture as well, and I've wrestled over them. And I have to confess, I don't really understand the suicidal dimension. I mean, and the biologize that with the Foucault's concept of state racism is itself pretty controversial.
Yes.
in some circles, right? That, you know, I'm looking at, and you know, maybe we can read a few lines together. I'm looking at page 258. He says, and it's in a nutshell, right? So the specificity of modern racism, or what gives it its specificity, is not bound up with mentalities, ideologies, or the lies of power. So this is interesting, right? It is bound up with the technique of power, with the technology of power. It is bound up with this, and that takes us as far away as possible from the race war and the intelligibility of history. We are dealing with a mechanism that allows biopower to work. So racism is bound up, he continues, with the workings of a state that is obliged to use race, creates race, you might say. The elimination of race is in the purification of the race to exercise its, and then he says here, sovereign power.
Power, right.
So, you know, this makes, you know, not to say that racism is unreal, but it makes racism a product of a certain ideology, right? Of a certain state ideology, and I'm.
And if I could just go riff on that a little bit, Stuart. And another thing it does is it takes racism away from the body and places it instead into that same old word again, an economy. Insofar as racism is a parsing of a population that enables the murderous function of the state to go on under biopolitical conditions. I mean, I think, Stuart, this is probably what you're getting at when you say that the Foucault's account of race is controversial, because it sort of removes race from the body or from ethnicity, as we tend to think of it, and pushes it off into questions of economy and relationship and a parsing of demographics.
He says that explicitly at one point, right? It's like when I say racism, I'm not talking about ethnic.
Yeah.
It's any kind of attempt to create discernments within a population, or to create a value hierarchy within a population, right? I mean, whether that's done around gender or sexuality or any other category. That's what he's talking about in terms of racism, is the evaluative hierarchy. I take that to be the case.
And so if this is the case, and I don't want to find myself in the position of defending Foucault. He certainly doesn't need it from the likes of me. But the Nazism example may not be as dated as we think, in the sense that ISIS might not have the same rhetorics of purity at work, but don't they have similar logics of economy at work and a certain parsing up of the population?
No doubt. I very much would agree with that. I mean, there's no economies without markets, right? And so, which is to say, there must be a distinction made in any kind of economy as to value. I mean, the word value, right? Like,
yeah, nice.
But I just wonder. I don't know. I mean, I sometimes feel as if, and it's weird for me because for so long I really felt like my thinking was very much in line with Foucault, and I would read criticisms of Foucault, and one of those criticisms was, it seems to me as if your historical claims are really overblown, and I'd be like, well, look, because he's not really making historical claims. I mean, he is and he isn't, right? And it's precisely that hinge that seems interesting to me, but I feel reading it now that I sort of agree with that the claims, and I don't mean that the historical thing is overblown, but it's like there's not enough complexity to the intersections among the disciplinary, the sovereign, the biopolitical, and within the biopolitical, right? I mean, if what he wants to do is say it's not like one has replaced the other, that they're functioning in concert, but they function differently in concert in psychiatry than they do in, like Walmart. I mean, so fine. So let's look at the sort of ratio of the harmonics, in a sense, of the biopolitical or of regimes of power, the harmonics of regimes of power in any particular practice. And I guess I just wanted to. I feel like I want a more. I feel like sometimes when I read this, I get a sense that there is a bad guy and not what I used to think in terms of Foucault was just like this proliferation of dangers. It's just everything's fucking dangerous, right? There's no place that you can feel good about acting. And when I read these sort of things, I feel like there are places that give, I don't know, like that would allow me to feel better because I'm working for surfaces, for instance. Or that I could convince myself that I'm invested in technology of the self rather than that terrible old disciplinary thing of the confession. That there's hope, in a sense, that I thought was the whole thing that I really liked about Foucault, was that there wasn't hope. There was only a differential action. I mean hope in a negative sense. I mean, in other words, in a non-economic sense, which is not just a question of the idea of redistribution or reallocation or differential, that strikes me as a totally interesting and compelling way to go about thinking about political change. And one of the things that doesn't allow you is, I don't know, a sort of positive position to simply stand on.
So, John, this is not going to satisfy you at all. In fact, it might only exacerbate the problem, but it is interesting to me that the lecture we read is the last lecture in the collection called Society Must Be Defended. Early on in that set of lectures, we get a fairly, what I take to be a fascinating reading of Hobbes and the Leviathan. And Foucault's reading is this, is that that Hobbes wanted to eliminate the historical facticity of war. He says, and think here about the fetishization of the literal. He says there are no fists, no weapons, and no blood. All you have in the Leviathan is this endless play of representations, right? Then you get at the very end of the book the sort of return to biopolitics, right? And there's a sense in which I think he's positioning biopolitics as a structural analog to Hobbes in the sense that both tend to be evasions of historical facticity and literalness and the body. Both trade endlessly in realms of representations, which is what makes them, which is what makes biopolitics so amenable to neoliberalism. So I don't know. I'm trying to connect that back to your question, and I've lost my train of thought.
But, no, but I think that, to me, that makes sense, right? I mean, and I take the basic premise, which is that life becomes something to be, life becomes a problem, right? A problematic for power to invest. That strikes me as whether or not it's right, interesting, you know, and compelling and productive, I guess. So I don't have a problem with the what I consider to be the kind of basic elements of it. It's I guess the distinctions that I'm questioning in ways that I didn't used to. I don't know. Because so here's another way of coming at this question then, which is, okay, fine. Biopolitics deals at the level of population. It's taken life as a problem and learned to invest it. And the whole thing that seems to concern him then subsequently is not that, but how can the state then continue to kill people? Right? How can death still operate within this economy of life? That seems to be the predominant investment, right? And so the initial issue, which is, let me ask it this way: what's the positivity of biopower? Or of a biopolitical regime? If it's, I mean, what's it so good at doing that it allows us to let people die in a callous fashion? That's, you know, I mean, I think you can answer that question in Nazism pretty clearly, right? Because you have a notion of a pure race. But if you don't have that notion, which I think leads to the suicidal thing, it's unclear to me why biopolitical power, I mean, this is to use his own argument, right? Like, how is it that biopolitical power would ever come to be obeyed if what it did was what he's describing here?
Is Stuart's answer of efficiency not good enough?
From the perspective of power, you know, as power as something outside of social relations, it's a perfectly good answer. But from the interior of social relations, it doesn't tell me why anyone, you know, would ever want to take part in this. I mean, let's talk about the positive. Let's think about what we would consider positive investments in biopower as opposed to the letting die. Let's talk about the making live, right? So this is, to me, what are we talking about? We're talking about healthcare, right? For instance, and medicine as hygiene, right? Or you know, working out, right? The sort of the exercise culture that we live in, and that is a component of health insurance policies, right? I mean, so you've got the overlaps between, you know, managing of accidents, right? The desire to manage potential accidents that happens at the level of the population. That's how, I mean, that's how the whole insurance, you know, industry operates. That we all have to have, right? So that's, to me, to look at that. So maybe I'm asking, how does that relate to the questions of the letting die? Because they seem like different operations to me. And maybe yet another way, I'll try a third way into this, because I'm thinking, by the way, I don't have a line on this. I'm thinking through this, all right? But one of the things that always surprised me when I read Foucault back in graduate school and was reading it with other people is that everybody found this to be this like ominous image of the social, which is like power is totalizing and everywhere, and there's no outside of power, you know. And again, that's that sort of tendency to think of power in the kind of Darth Vader sense, you know, as opposed to immanent in any social relation. So because when I read Foucault, when I read History of Sexuality, even Discipline and Punish, but more History of Sexuality, I got this sense of like incredible sort of celebration, a tone of excitement and exuberance at possibilities, which is that if power really is everywhere, then everything's involved in producing transformations to its economies. And so it seems like in the notion of biopower, what's happened is we've returned to the ominous Darth Vader Foucault. Is that?
Well, I'm going to say two things. First, the bios of biopower is at once on the surfaces when you talk about healthcare, insurance, managing risk, and so on. These are specific interventions. These are specific strategies, right, to manage life. And at the same time, though, there's a kind of sacred dimension of life as well. So it works. It's deeply metonymic. It's ontotheological. Life replaces it stands in for those specific instances of everyday life and everyday living, right? So which include getting sick, falling down, hurting yourself, needing health care, needing to manage risk, and so on and so forth. And then the second thing is that in these specific sort of techniques or technologies of making live and managing, as Foucault says, death becomes disqualified. There's this sacralization of life as a sort of a general concept which we seem to all get behind. And you know, this is the whole sort of thrust behind sort of affirmative biopolitics. It's like, what's wrong with an ambulance coming when you dial 911? That's really great, right? So we need more of that. But when we look at how, you know, this functions, Foucault says, well, security mechanisms need to be set up. So we start to get a disciplinary structure sort of coming in. We need to have protect lives on airplanes. So we need a whole TSA establishment. We need to pay extra for our tickets and so on and so forth, so that we can be our bodies can be sort of scanned and patted down and so on and so forth to make sure that we are not a security risk. And so we build enormous prisons. And you know, interestingly enough, and I just have to say, going back to the Ashley Smith case, I mean, it becomes complicated because the Correctional Service of Canada's response to the recommendations coming out of the coroner's inquest, the inquiry, the response was a kind of a lamentation that, well, we've removed funding from mental health care across the state, and that prisons have become de facto asylums. So they kind of say, well, it's a shame, but what are we supposed to do? We have insufficient resources, and we can't. We're corrections. We're not paid to care. You know, we're not. So you end up with all of these sort of stratifications and collapsing and so forth of various administrative bodies, various institutions and organizations, and you know, it becomes really clear that part of the project of making live means to make these sort of arbitrary distinctions, to make these secure, and you end up with, in the name of life, right? In the name of in a sacred name of life, in the name of protecting the population, you end up with a lot of people behind bars, sometimes indefinitely, for very you know, 3 strikes, you know, for ridiculous and meanwhile the real criminals, you know, walk free, right? The war criminals, former presidents who will remain unnamed, and vice presidents and so forth. But so, you know, there are various levels of crime, there are various levels of livingness here, and I don't see how you can have a program of making live within an economy, within with scarce resources. You know, not everyone gets the A+ health plan, right? Some people don't get anything, right? If you're an immigrant, well, you know, I don't know, Obamacare maybe. If you're a refugee, it's a different. You get on the C plan, I guess, or something like that. But you can't have the project of making live for everyone without sort of making these cuts, right? Without drawing a line.
This is where Foucault introduces the category of evolution, right? Not so much, he says, not so much in a Darwinian sense, but as a category. He introduces it almost as a relay, right? How does the political enter into the biological? It enters vis-a-vis the category of evolution, and more precisely, the category of survival of the fittest, right? That some survive by the fact that others don't, right? And I think this, Stuart, what you're getting at with the A, B, and C plans, right? Not everyone gets the A plan. I think it's a great question to ask. I don't know the answer to it. Does the conception of biopolitics, as Foucault lays it out, require the category of evolution for its implementation, right? Because, or as John put it, does it require the security state? Also a good question, but the security state, I think the reason that gets implemented in Foucault's terms is because the category of evolution sits as a relay term between the political and the biological. And as he says, this is 257, that evolution became the real way of thinking about colonization, the necessity for wars, criminality, the phenomena of madness and mental illness. We could also insert such categories as public hygiene, exercise, immunity, health insurance, right? And to the extent that evolution is a sort of acting category and all that stuff, it means that the affirmative biopolitics that we sort of associate with Nicholas Rose is going to be sort of always complemented by the security state and the not so pretty side of biopolitics.
Well, and the not so pretty side is, you know, profit.
Right. Good.
So you know, I think we could answer your question, John, if we could, you know, if we could have a conference call with some executives of insurance companies and ask them precisely why the life of a 32-year-old black man on the south side of Chicago is worth an insurance payout so much less than the life of, and you insert whatever, or why the life of someone with children is worth more than the, you know, it's about the kinds of calculations, the things that we value. There's a complex history there, right? So
that's where, and just to jump in, because that's where I totally agree with you guys, and that's where I agree with Foucault, is that for me is one of the points of the insurance guy who makes that decision isn't a racist and doesn't have to be a racist in any usual understanding of the term. He is simply applying an economic algorithm to a population, right? And so his answer to that question, which is totally justified, is it because that's how the payout works, right? I mean, that's how the sort of business model operates. So that's where, like, so fine, that guy on the south side of Chicago becomes simply, he is simply a data point, and is not an individual, and I am a data point, but like a superior one or whatever in that hierarchy of values. So that's the point which I feel like you guys are. I mean, this direction. This seems totally right to me. So I don't. I mean, obviously I'm thinking through, but that I think you're totally right about that. So.
But you know, it's a very complex question. Why this should be? Right. Because we can say sort of. On the surface, if we're dealing with surfaces, this is just wrong and unfair, and yet it is. And you know, so why do we tolerate? Why are we complicit in this kind of a system, right? That values some lives over others, and we all sort of wear our stickers that say Black Lives Matter because we believe in our hearts that yeah, of course, but you know, we're still buying insurance from these people, and we're still complicit in a system that really says that black lives don't matter as much.
Well, so let me ask this then. Maybe this is one source of reservation. Is I guess I feel like there's not enough discussion of markets here. Like, I mean, is it that Foucault's aversion to an economic determinism is prevents him from saying? I mean, you know, there's very little discussion of capitalism because he wants his analytics. I mean, in each of the books, right? He wants his analytics to not be associated. And so for me, if I connect biopower to neoliberalism in the ways that you're doing, it makes so much more sense to me than just thinking of it in terms of biopower.
Yeah, and he does that in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures, which frustrates people because they think they're going to get a book on biopolitics and they get a book on German and American brands of neoliberalism, right? And the sort of one of the salient points there is that sort of biopolitics operates. In fact, I tend to say neoliberal biopolitics because that's what we have. The biopolitics through in a neoliberal way, biopolitics operates through the sort of marketization or monetization of everything, including human lives and relationships and so on, based on this idea that we're a particular form of we're human capital. So. And you know, maybe that explains why some lives get bigger insurance payouts than others, because they, you know, they're bearers of human capital in ways that I'm sure there's a complex calculus that goes into in insurance payouts, certainly, but.
Well, would you say then in that case, the bios, the life, which is the thing, the point of application, is really just kind of a secondary phenomena for a larger economics, which is to say that economics or markets, it's more of a I don't know, and I don't want to say finance because that implies too much, but it's like it's market power, and what market power does is it invents the notion of biopower, right? Like that the bios, that's just one of its products. It's one of its products that it manages in particular ways. You know, and the larger question then is a generalized marketization.
You might then say that it's the greatest. Life is the greatest ruse of a market economy.
Exactly.
Because we think that it's ours, and that, but of course, you know, labor has taken over life.
I mean, I like that. That's a good conclusion for me.
Yeah, I like it too. Let me ask a follow-up question. Stuart, is it fair to say, and it's been a while since I've read Birth of Biopolitics, is it fair to say that Foucault, particularly in his biopolitical mode, is good at economy in the sense that he's good at thinking networks and distributions and demographics, but he's not good at thinking markets? And not that you can have one without the other, but it is possible to have an emphasis on an economy without a corresponding emphasis on a market. And I do wonder, John, if you're onto something there, that Foucault is strong on the economy angle of biopolitics, but he's not so good on the market angle of biopolitics, which might explain why, and again, it's been a while since I've read Birth of Biopolitics, but I seem to remember that the categories of liberalism and neoliberalism in that book they're differentiated, but not all that starkly. They sort of blend together, and I wonder if that too is an effect of not taking it's sort of an insufficient market thought.
Yeah, and I think you're right. He thinks through economies. His whole the conduct of conduct, if you read those lectures, is all about it's oikonomia psychon, right? It's the economy of souls, right? It's the management of the household. It's so conducting people's conduct is a kind of, so he goes, of course, he goes back to the Greeks to sort of to take this notion, this sort of more less market-based notion of economy. And so I think, yeah, I think you're right there. I think that he's not doing a Marxist reading. He's doing we could say he's doing economies of medicine in the birth of the clinic, right? He's doing.
I think that's to me a very provocative point. The distinction between the economic and the market in Foucault, and wondering, for me, maybe that might actually, it's feeling like that resonates for me as a point of discomfort, that there's not enough of a market logic, and it doesn't have to be a Marxist market logic, you know, but thinking of that's where, to me, like Stuart, your connections of the biopolitical and neoliberal resonate so much more with me than really when I read Foucault in general, you know. And I think it's because the whole issue here is the production of markets. Now, the second question, which is like, what are different ways of intervening in markets, becomes a really different question than what are the ways of intervening in economies. You know?
Right, and I don't think you can do one without the other. In fact, right, you'd have to say, since an economy is by definition more social than a market, which really only sort of measures, you know, the movement of goods, right? That we need to ask, perhaps in a Foucauldian vein, what are the various economies and our investments, metaphorically, in them that allow our markets to continue, that allows them.
But not metaphorically. I think that whole investment, the libidinal question, is very much like, there's a market, right? And we need to, and like, okay, let's own, in a neoliberal contemporary sense, let's own desire as a market, right? And let's look at how the market operates and what its differential properties are. I'm not saying, let's own it. Right?
Are you marketizing your desire, John?
No, my desire has been already marketized for me. I'm just recognizing that it is. So, to me, that's very provocative, I think.
Well, I think if it's been marketized, you no longer own it. You can own it, but that's just a ruse, right? That's just like saying, oh, well, it's my life, but I go to work, right? So it's owning that's the greatest ruse of all, that we own something.
Life becomes an effect for biopolitics in the same way that the soul was an effect for disciplinary power. They're both, life is now a fold, right? It's a fold of the market.
That's good. I like that.
I like that as well, and that is, I mean, particularly insofar as the failure of sovereignty in that case makes so much more sense to me, which is that it took life as a given, and that's why death was a problem, is because somebody else had the sovereign control over that. So, but if you don't take life as a given and you see it as like it's something that power is producing for you, it's a commodity that you're basically subletting life, and here are all of the things that you get from it, and what you get from it are health, happiness, sex, whatever. Well, you know, whatever. Like, you get life, right? But now I understand why one would want that, right?
I mean, you could put exactly the same conclusion in terms of the history of economics by saying the problem with liberalism is that it took life for granted. It took sort of the individual as a sort of given starting point, and it was that sort of here I gotta be careful with my terms. It was that liability that neoliberalism then corrects.
I mean, that's good. You guys are smart.
I'm reading you, John.
Don't do that. Are you guys tired yet?
What else you got?
I'm energized.
What's that?
I'm energized. This is great.
I'm actually totally energized right now, so I want to go back in. I haven't read enough of the biopolitics. I mean, it's interesting to me, and maybe it's worth like getting your guys' version of this, because so the piece that you read that I wrote was, I mean, that's from gosh, it has to have been 15, maybe 18 years ago that I wrote it. And you can tell it's really one of the peculiar things is I'm clearly trying to sort of defend, in a sense, Foucault against a kind of leftist refusal to engage it, right? This, which is not at all the case anymore. I mean, it seems like there's been a significant transition in the last 18 years when I haven't really been working on Foucault or paying it. You know, when all the Foucault stuff starts getting published is about when I got into Deleuze, you know, for better or for worse. And so, like the biopower and all the things all of those things, I just really haven't spent very much time with. And so, I mean, it's interesting to me, at least, that the Foucault that was the Foucault when I was in graduate school was an historical, political thinker whose primary theoretical contribution was offering up a non-Marxist conception of power, right? Which is that power is productive and it makes things. And I remember frequently reading essays that would begin with the recognition that for Foucault, power is productive. I mean, that was a recurring theme for essays around that time. So you start off by saying, in Foucault, power is productive. But then all of the essays would then go on to show the really sort of subtle ways in which power sort of controlled you. And it's like, I felt like that missed the point, which is that it can't be a question of control in the usual sense if there's no you or no nothing there prior to power. Right. So what we have to be talking about then is different technologies of power, and that's obviously where his work it was taken up more along those differential technologies that intersect, and that's where you guys, I mean, that's the version of Foucault that you guys are really working with that I find, I mean, just really different from the one that I read 20 years ago.
I don't know, John. I liked reading your piece today. I had read it years ago. I really liked reading it today. What struck me today is that I'm not sure who your target is, but your target seemed like it was a vision of classical liberalism. So sort of consider your targets here: Nancy Fraser,
Yeah.
Habermas, Richard Rorty, Spaces of Primal Liberty, sort of an autonomous subject as a sort of the origin of resistance. All this is not, I don't think of that as leftist stuff.
Yeah.
I think of that as like classical liberalism, right? To which Foucault has a brilliant answer, right? And the disciplinary power, I think, is brilliantly tailored to classical liberalism. And so you get this line about 2/3 of the way through Discipline and Punish. It's one of my favorite lines in the whole book. Foucault says, "The Enlightenment, which discovered the liberties, also invented the disciplines," right? So you get this sense that's like liberalism and discipline go hand in hand, right? What Stuart's work is so good at, and which had never really occurred to me until I dove into Stuart's work, both this piece and then some conversations back a couple years, was the articulation of disciplinary power and liberalism is matched by another articulation of neoliberalism and biopolitics, right? And it seems that there's an essay waiting to be written here that sort of calibrates Foucault's workings on power with the different economic schemes. I mean, he's a schematic thinker, but he doesn't include economies or sort of economic visions of the economy within these schemas, and I think it would be pretty easy to do that. And actually, that's one of the things that reading you guys back to back this morning really helped me see. I don't know where that puts us, but
Thanks, Dave. I became obsessed with the metonym, and I started, rereading your essay, and I've started to think about ways that the biopolitics operates as the, and I think the schema that you just gave is really useful. The shift from liberalism and discipline to neoliberalism and the kinds of politico, legal, medical subjects that each of these sort of schematics, as it were, treats, right? Or not, well, treats, but constitutes, I guess you'd say.
And both of them, if we take the schematic one step further, in both cases, the role of disciplinary power on one hand and biopolitics on the other hand, the role of both of those things is to enable, for lack of a better term, the killing machine to keep going, right? So this line from Discipline and Punish, and although the universal juridicism of modern society seems to fix limits on the exercise of power, okay, think liberalism, its universally widespread panopticism enables it to operate on the underside of the law, a machinery that is both immense and minute, which supports, reinforces, and multiplies the asymmetry of power. Okay? Put that next to the discussion of racism and biopolitics earlier, which has the exact same function, right? Within the neoliberal regime, it's the category of race and evolution and biopolitics that enable the killing to go forward. And Foucault's really good on this, isn't he? I mean, he's so good at sort of taking visions of the economy that would seem to disallow violence and then looking at how those visions are modulated and through what terms they're modulated in order to see how violence actually plays itself out.
And the added problem once we get rid of liberalism, which of course we haven't, because the liberal subject is the liberal humanist individual is of course the pillar of democracy, law, and so on. It's
right.
the
Republicanism.
It's it's what's presupposed as the greatest fiction that never existed. Once we get rid of that, the problem is that there is no subject, there's no agency, there's no site of resistance. Just as there's no, so back to what you began with, what is the point of application of power if it's on man as species, if it's on species life, if it's on endemics and particular populations, right? Who or what will resist? Who or what will? What conception of moral or political agency can we imagine? And that's, I think, why Foucault's sort of quasi-answer to that is in the technologies of the self, right? Is in the return to the Greeks, to what you call sort of an anti-rhetorical, anti-metonymic, to surfaces, I guess, to bodies, maybe to bodies and pleasures.
Which is why, at the end of the day, I'm going to vote for tropology as an organizing term for Foucault rather than folds, because although they do similar work in talking about interiority, I feel like tropology has the it also gives us a certain reversibility, right? And Foucault plays on that reversibility, right? If we can imagine sort of a movement to depth, Foucault at least had no problem reversing that movement to think about resistance, right? And whereas it's, and this part might just be my own ignorance here, but I have difficulty thinking in the metaphor of fold. How would you reverse that, or sort of undo?
Unfold.
What?
Unfold.
I don't know what that means.
I'm comfortable with the tropological. I mean, obviously one has to be careful in terms of the history of it, but in fact, I just wrote this thing's coming out right now where I argue that the paradigmatic image of rhetoric should be heliotropism. Like that should be rather than a sort of deliberative moment of a presidential address, it should be a plant turning towards the sun, and precisely because of the tropic and material qualities of that. So I don't have a problem with the tropological, and I'm with you. It's funny to me because I think of when you in your essay you move towards the tropological, you do it as against a notion of persuasion, and I always think of persuasion as tropology par excellence, which is this is a Michael Noss book, which is the original understanding of persuasion was like pre-Aristotle was turning. I mean, that's what it meant. It meant it was a turning. So a persuasion was a reorientation towards whether it's a belief or anything else. So to that extent, I've always thought of persuasion in tropological terms that aren't necessarily consciousness driven. So
yeah, that's good. That's good, John. Yeah, I think that's actually better than I have it. I think what I was trying to do was, it seemed too often to me that Foucault would be identified as a tropological thinker, and then sort of use that observation to put him in the same category as Peter Ramus or something.
Yeah.
I sort of wanted to hold on to something historically valuable here. And I probably, in that quest, I probably sort of gave short shrift to the history of persuasion. It's sort of the intersecting history.
But you're not, like, lots of the sort of contemporary understanding of it is, you're quite right. I mean, I totally see why people want to distance themselves from persuasion, because it's a liberal subject whose consciousness must be changed, and they've got, So I understand that. But as we know, like, no concept buys you out of anything. You have to do work on any given concept in order to make it work one way or the other. I just happen to, like, I bought property in persuasion, long ago, and continue to think that it's potentially fertile ground. But it has to get reworked, right? It's not. I can't just say, well, really, rhetoric's about persuasion, without saying, in fact, persuasion is about plants turning towards the sun. Right, that you have to do that work in each case. So. But for me, I mean, one of the fears I have of tropology is language, right? Like the sort of language centeredness of our tradition. So that's why I want, like, my image of tropes is going to be heliotropism. That's what a trope really is. And by the way, metaphor, metonymy, they're derivative of that. Right?
Well, I'll let you have your heliotropism here. But I'm not sure that tropology is too overly discursive or overly linguistic. Isn't it just... I mean, I was trying to think about this today, because what are these tropes for Foucault? Other than... it's hard to say. Other than, like, ways he envisions different forms of articulation, right? So he's looking for terms to describe particular and repeatable relationships, which the history of tropes via Nietzsche lets him do. I don't think there's any sort of overly linguisticness there.
No, not to his, and I agree with what you're saying in terms of what he's doing with it. I'm just saying it costs, you have to do a little bit of work on that term in general conversation. I agree with you in terms of the Nietzschean trajectory is the same, at least for me, it's the same one that I'm following. So that makes total sense, You'll give me my heliotropism.
You can be logophobic if you want.
But I have a beef with your metaphor metonymy reading in Nietzsche. But
I needed that reading. That was Jerry's condition of acceptance. Were you a reviewer, John? You may have been a reviewer who had
I might have been. It sounded familiar when I reread it.
Yeah, and one of the reviewers had that beef, and I had to dig up all these extra sources on that one. But that was Jerry's condition of publication.
Is that right?
Yeah. I won't hang my hat on that one.
That's probably me being an ass, but because to me, I mean, and it actually matters in terms of this thinking of surfaces, by the way. But the larger point for me is that, like, actually, it seems like what you show me is that Foucault is an intensely unrhetorical thinker, which is to say, the problem is the extent to which metonymy is orchestrating social relations, and that the objective for him would be to get behind the rhetorical to the pure surface, right? To the sort of just bodies and pleasures as the synecdoche for it, or technologies of the self as a synecdoche, and
I mean, he's unrhetorical in the sense that he's moving towards bodies and pleasures,
right?
But it's the categories of rhetoric, right, that sort of give that movement meaning.
Well, they're the problem, right? They're the thing that's the things that we need to get behind, or get past, or get around, or get somehow not there.
Yeah, I mean, he does sort of very, very sort of explicitly identify and cast his lot with these sort of technologies of the self, which which he twice calls non-rhetorical. I mean, sort of. I mean, and if that's what you're getting at, I mean, I agree with you. And it was that sort of strange insistence that got this essay started, trying to figure out what in the world is non-rhetorical about this stuff.
But there's a way. I mean, I think that there is a way against Foucault to bring it back in, which is to say, if one reads that Truth and Lies that you engage in there, what metaphor actually is, and I understand we're using metaphor and metonymy fairly interchangeably, and we're not using it in any kind of, but what metaphor means there is, as he says, the stammering translation into a completely foreign language, which is to say, you have nerve stimuli that forms an image. You have an image that you attach a word to. Those are examples of metaphors. Neither of those is more abstract than the other. It's just one material to another material, right? It's not a.
His example of that process is the person who's seeing in concepts and is thus blind to like the body parts, right? The fibers of the body. He has that great line about the bloodstream and.
Well, but so this is a different operation. So like concept formation, which happens simultaneously with word formation for him, that to me is exactly what you're talking about, which is the metonymic relation, then substitution. But the initial metaphorical relation for Nietzsche isn't that. It is one material to another material. Nerve stimulus image. One is not more abstract or more general than the other. They're just, and that's why I love that. For me,
but that moment isn't. That moment from stimulus to image is not the definitive moment in that essay. Right?
No, it's concept formation. You're right. I mean, concept formation is the erasure of difference. It is all those things. But concept formation is enabled by metaphors, right? So, but what metaphor means is what I think Foucault would call surfaces, which is like a movement from, which is why I really like the phrase stammering translation into a completely foreign language, which is just like there's one thing and then there's another thing. And to ask the question of the correspondence between them is to just misunderstand that they're just different things.
No. To ask the question of correspondence is to put the category of aesthetics on the table, right? Right? Because for Nietzsche, it's always a question of aesthetics, right? When you translate something into a completely foreign tongue, there's no question of relation.
No question of
accuracy. There's a question only ever of style. I mean, this is your term. It's sort of like, what's your style? How are you going to translate it?
Right. Right. That's why in that instance you can read metaphor precisely as the kind of surface via Nietzsche, even if Foucault doesn't do that.
That's an interesting thought. I'd have to mull on that one a little bit. Because it seems like Nietzsche doesn't do that. Nietzsche talks about metaphor and immediately cuts to concept formation.
Right, right. And they're simultaneous, so it's not like, I mean, at least in the way he discusses it in the essay, it's not like, well, first you have this, and then you have, but they are different kinds of operations, and that metaphor for him seems to be that stammering translation. Aesthetic, you're right, which is to say, the question of to what extent does the movie correspond to the novel is a stupid question because it's a movie, and that's a novel, right? And it's the same like nerve stimulus, image. Correspondence, bad question. Only relation is one of style or aesthetics, which is to say thing happens, and those are the conditions of possibility for the erasure of difference and concept formation and the metonymy in the way that you're talking about it. This is what I just did there, I believe, is like that's deconstruction, which is to say every time you think you see a metaphor, you actually see a metonymy, and metonymy is just the sort of substitution of material for material rather than abstract for concrete. When you think you're trading the concrete for an abstract, you're actually just trading for another concrete. And I mean, they use the terms of metaphor and metonymy exactly the opposite of the way that we're using them, but that's neither here nor there.
One way to sort of wrap this back to Foucault is to think about the very end of that Nietzsche essay where he talks about the man who falls in the same ditch multiple times, right? The lack of concepts, right? And so it seems like one of the things that Foucault picks up from Nietzsche is this valorization of the literal to such an extent that Nietzsche valorizes the guy that keeps falling into the same ditch to the extent that Foucault sort of has this always and only recourse to bodies and pleasures, but the logic seems to at least run in parallel tracks.
I see that, although for me the end of that essay is interesting because I feel like he's making fun of the idiot who keeps falling into the ditch over and over, and that in fact the great moment of deception is the guy who, when he sees a storm cloud, just walks out from underneath it, which is to say the extraordinary moment, the magical terminus point is banal, right? It's just this stupid little everyday occurrence where, like, look, it's a storm cloud, get out from underneath it, dumbass. You know, it's not like radically different sensations, which is to say concept formations are an operation that allow for activities and allow you to play with concepts themselves. That's where, to me, the Nietzsche line sort of goes further than the way that we're talking about Foucault on this.
Okay, one of the things you're really good at doing right now is inserting the category of style in between Nietzsche and Foucault.
I'm not trying to do that, but I take your point. I take your point. I'm trying to figure out whether or not I should write this book on style. So it's constantly, you know how that goes. When you're in the midst of that and you're like, it's all I can think in terms of, you know.
Yes, you should.
Okay. This is great stuff. I've totally enjoyed it. Like, I'm looking forward to reading, to going back over this and viewing it and spending some time with it in editing, because I think that there are like several moments that are cash money to me. So.
Yeah, it's been fun.
I'll do thanks for participating and thanks for bringing the energy and interest in this. I enjoyed reading your guys' pieces and chatting about this. And I mean, I want to put in a plug or ask for a request. I mean, so far I'm doing this with friends and people that I know, but I'm interested in expanding that. And if you have ideas for folks who you might think would be inclined to do such a thing, please send me names of people. And I did one last week with Nate Stormer and Diane Keeling, and I didn't know Diane at all. Do you guys know Diane? Yeah, I didn't know her. Well, actually, I'll stop recording at this point. There's no